Thank you, Peter, for the invitation to come to Northern Ireland. I've been to Ireland once before, but it was just down in County Cork, and so this is quite a different experience from that. And always a pleasure to come back to the islands. Live in the islands, and it's always nice to go to another set of islands, albeit in a very different kind of climate. When Peter and I were talking about different things that I might address in coming here, one of the ideas that we kind of ran through initially was trying to look at issues of freedom and to try to square this notion of freedom and equity. And that we abandoned for some reason and decided on doing higher education, globalization, and issues of diversity. And he suggested that maybe I keep the Buddhism relatively in the background for this talk and talk more about the issues, allow the talk to be informed by the kind of Buddhist conceptual resources that I work with. And so I kind of prepared remarks with that in mind, but certainly happy to kind of go deeper into the Buddhist perspectives that inform the talk, if anybody's interested in that, or to talk about the issues more generally as I frame them here. I work at the East-West Center, and it's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. One of the projects that we have is called the International Forum on Education 2020, and it started about 8-9 years ago with the idea that globalization processes are affecting higher education, education broadly, but higher education in particular, and that the response from higher education was one that people that we polled throughout the Asia-Pacific region were unanimous in saying one thing, and that is that our education systems, higher education systems, are not responding to these changes in a way that's appropriate. That somehow our education systems are not doing the jobs that we want them to do. When we asked the further question of what do you mean by that, it seemed as if the response is sorted out along two different tracks. One set of people said higher education has fallen out of step with contemporary realities, especially market realities, that we're not producing with our universities the kind of graduates that the market wants. So we're not producing graduates of the sort that industry wants, that politics wants, that society needs at this point. So we somehow have to retool that. And part of the solution, as they anticipated it, was we need to move toward a more individually centered, more choice-driven, consumer-driven form of education that operates more or less like the market does, and in a sense, marketize higher education. Opposite to that were folks who felt that this was precisely the problem, that higher education had capitulated to the market model, and that in fact what had started off as one of modernity's great contributions to the human race, which was the idea that education is a universal public good, that everybody should have access to higher education, everybody should have access to education at least, ideally to higher education, and that by capitulating to market sort of demands, that higher education was giving up the serving as a public good in the interest, as a public good in the interest of the public good, that it stopped reflecting consciously on what the public good might consist of at the point in time that we now are at the 21st century, that was really a liability. So there's this tension in views. The unanimous view is education is not doing the job we want, but there's a tension within that dissatisfaction as to what it would mean to respond to the contemporary realities in a way that's appropriate, and they work in very opposite directions. So what I'd like to do is try to frame the dynamics that lead to this dilemma occurring, where we have two, in fact, quite plausible responses to the difficulties taking place with education. They're both quite real. You know, students who are graduating from Chinese universities that are not finding jobs, or Indian universities that are not finding jobs, are really faced with that first horn of the dilemma. The education that I've gotten has not prepared me in the way that allows me to get a job. So what do I do now? I've invested this time, I've invested this money, and now what do I do? It's a real issue to be faced. And yet the concerns that we have, those of us especially who work in higher education, with the marketization of it, the corporatization of the university, it's a great concern because we see it as losing the ability to have what this Education Forum on Education 2020, International Forum, really had one of its aspirations, and that's how can higher education stop merely responding to and always playing catch-up to processes of globalization, and instead start to inform those dynamics in a productive way that really responds to this notion of higher education as serving the public good. So what I want to do is to sort of step back from that and ask, well, how did this situation occur? What conditions drive that? One of the insights of the Buddha, and this will be one of my little side references, is that we can only deal with conflict, troubles, and difficulties that we're experiencing in the present on the basis of things as they've come to be. And the Pali word is yathabhutam, and it's, I think, a past perfect participle for those of you who do grammar. It's not just things as they are at present. It's not just things as they are at the current moment. As if we could take a snapshot and say, here's how things are today. That's what we need to deal with. What the Buddha was saying, we actually need history, that histories make a difference. And it's not history in the singular, it's histories in plural. Because we have different actors, different agents, different participants, different perspectives that are all informing the present condition. If we take account of those differences of perspective, we have multiple histories, and those multiple histories need to inform our understanding of the dynamics that we're responding to. You can't do it in terms of a snapshot. You need some historical perspective. For the sake of getting through the material quickly, I'm just going to focus on two aspects of some structural changes that have been going on in the last half century or so that really affect higher education in a particularly powerful way. And that's the development of global networks and what's been referred to as reflexive modernization. Manuel Castells came up with the idea that we've been going through a global organizational structural change that's related to what he called the emergence of global informational capitalism, or the advent of the network society. It's a very interesting sort of phenomenon that he does a quite thorough analysis of in his 3 or 4 books that he's written on the theme. For most of us, our experience of the network sort of society coming about as a result of a kind of an unusual collusion among the communications, military, and industrial sort of phenomenon in society. Most of us experience it in terms of the almost remarkable openness of access to information with the burgeoning of social media. So we experience it as individuals, and as individuals, it seems like an awfully good thing that through, for example, the internet, we have tremendous access to just about any kind of information that we'd want. We may want to problematize whether that's knowledge. It's also been referred to as the transition to a knowledge economy. We may want to contest whether it's really a knowledge economy or not. But we certainly have access to information. It's really been quite remarkable. But what Castells does in terms of his analysis of networks is really quite interesting, because there are a couple of structural features about networks that have an impact on larger scale processes that are being networked together. Those are economic, political, social, cultural, technological. Networks grow according to 2 kinds of processes, 2 kinds of feedback. There's negative or stabilizing feedback, that is feedback that to the system says, you're doing the right thing, keep up with it. You're growing just fine, the network itself is growing, the contributions are robust, the informational quality that's coming through the different nodes is quite robust, everything's working along fine, keep it going. And then positive feedback that says, we're reaching points of retardation, we're reaching points of recursion, we're reaching points where we're not growing at all. And for that, we need to adapt. That kind of feedback drives differentiation processes and accelerates interactions, drives differentiation. So what's interesting about networks is that in a sense, structurally, what's important about networks is not how close you are to the center. It's not how close you are to the top of a hierarchy. They're not hierarchically ordered. In a university, your power depends on how close you are. It's the president, the chancellor, the head of school, whoever's in that authority figure in the hierarchy. In networks, it's not like that. That the value of being within the network is not how close you are to the center or the top of the network. It's a function of how many different nodes there are in the network and how robust the informational exchanges are through those nodes. So the value of membership in it depends on how many nodes are involved, as well as the quantity of information being exchanged. So it's not just, there are scale issues that are involved with networks. So the differentiation of networks, the fact that network growth is driven by differentiation and accelerating interaction, means 2 kinds of things when it takes place at the sort of economic level. And that's that economic systems that depend on networked relationships will grow on the basis of increasing differentiation, an increasing interaction, which means that there's going to be a connection between vitality and volatility. Now that's exactly what we saw with the financial crisis that started I guess it's now more like 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and that we're still living with the effects of the global recession that started in the US. A lot of that had to do with the development of investment instruments that were leveraging risk up to 30% beyond what anyone had any reasonable set of beliefs that they could have gotten the returns. And they were basically dumping bad investments on others. So there was a leveraging of risk that was driving the economic growth in the US, that then when the bottom fell out of the US mortgage market, it had the ripple effects that went around the world. But that volatility of the global financial markets was part of the vitality that had been driving all the growth up to that point in 2008, 2009. And that wasn't an unusual circumstance. If you talk to people in the investment world, if you talk to people that operate at the stock market level, where they're those folks who are really making the decisions in the 18-second window of opportunity that the half-life of information has on the stock market floor, they say the same thing, that the way in which you make real growth happen is by flirting with that edge of risk, that you've got to engage the volatility. In fact, you produce volatilities in order to increase your profit margins. So we live with the effects of that. That relationship between vitality and volatility is part of what's embedded within the kind of thinking that goes into reflexive modernization theory that's developed by people like Ulrich Beck, Anthony Giddens, Scott Lash. And basically, their theory is that sometime around the middle of the 20th century, industrial processes reached the point that they became, in a sense, reflexive, that it was no longer possible to externalize the cost of continued industrial growth. That means that the discussion stops being just about public goods and starts to be about public bads. So the discourse on environmental pollution that began in the 1960s was the first indicator that we've sort of reached that point. Climate change is now the kind of poster issue of these kinds of concerns, that we've now reached the point that the effects of the successes of the industrial systems that are producing the kind of economic growth that everybody around the world seems to want are now producing these ironic consequences. The consequences of growth on the basis of the production of, in principle, unpredictable risk, threats, and hazards, in the face of which we nevertheless have to make responsible decisions. So that everybody knows that, for example, deep water oil drilling, I mentioned to some folks earlier, or nuclear power generation, are part of governmental plans for supplying the kind of energy that's needed to continue the economic growth that is being fostered on the basis of rising standards of living, incomes, access to resources, services, and so on globally. Everybody's doing that. And yet, can you insure a power plant, a nuclear power plant? Can you insure for the damages that were being promulgated throughout the Gulf of Mexico when the deep water oil drilling rigs burned up in the Gulf, what was that, 3 years ago, 4 years ago? The effects of that are still being felt. The effects of the power plant meltdown of Fukushima are still being felt in Japan. Big changes are afoot in Japan about how they're thinking about nuclear power generation, but for most people in Japan, they recognize that we made a bargain. And the bargain was, in order to continue growth at the level that they wanted to do it, they needed nuclear power. They couldn't be reliant on oil. They just couldn't put themselves in that position, having no oil reserves of their own. So the conditions for sustaining that kind of growth requires us to make commitments to industrial processes like deep oil drilling or nuclear power generation that put us in a position of facing potentially disastrous consequences for which there's against which there's no possibility of insuring. So the damages that are being wrought in the Gulf of Mexico are now, there's a settlement that was under place of roughly $20 billion. It doesn't even come close to compensating for the real damages to the people's lives in the region. If you started looking at the environmental damages and the long-term damages to the fisheries, it's really an unimaginable amount of money. Nobody really is in a position to calculate it. Nevertheless, those are the conditions under which we live. And if we see contemporary global dynamics through these two lenses of network society and reflexive modernization, then it becomes kind of interesting looking at the kinds of inequalities that are developing apace with the kinds of industrial processes that, especially over the last 50 years, we've been engaged in. Globalization, as I said, reflexive modernization, as it's been playing out, doesn't just produce public goods. It's not just increases of wealth and access to resources. It's also the public bads. It's the pollution. It's the distribution of the effects of climate change. If we look at things like the distributions of wealth, income, and resource access, some of the numbers are really quite stunning. As of 2006, when the first comprehensive study of global wealth was done, the top 1% of households in the world had 40% of global wealth. The bottom 50% of households in the world had less than 1% of global wealth. And if you did a per capita analysis, it would look worse, because the wealthiest 1% of households are typically small households, 3 to 4 people. The households at the poor end of the spectrum are generally much larger households, so the actual numbers of people involved are quite a bit stronger than that statistic would allow you to believe. In the US, from 1976 to 2007, a 30-year period, the amount of wealth that was owned by the top 1% in the country went from 19% to 36%, just about doubled. At the time that it was measured in 2007, the bottom 40% of Americans, it was about 140 million people, had less than 1/3 of 1% of global wealth. And they're worse off now after the financial crisis than they were in 2007. In that 30-year period, of the total increase of income in the US, 80% went to the top 1%. So 4/5 of every extra dollar earned in the country went to 1% of the population. And that's a global phenomenon. We can look at the same statistics playing out over the last 2 centuries and see that there's been this progression from a 3-to-1 ratio of the top quintile, the top 20% of countries in the world in terms of wealth and income, and the bottom 20% of countries. The ratio was 3-to-1 in 1820. In 1913, it was 13-to-1. In 1950, it was 35-to-1. In 1973, it was 55-to-1. In 1997, the last time that the clear number was done, it was 86-to-1. Estimates that I've seen that are sort of unofficial, they're not UN documented numbers, it's 135-to-1. So the ratio, the gap, the relative gap between the wealthiest and the poorest has been on this historical trajectory of increasingly wide gaps, which puts the poorest of the world not just at a disadvantage, but at a relatively enlarging disadvantage. They're being relationally disadvantaged. Now, the inconvenient truth that these phenomena are bringing home to us is that contemporary globalization patterns, contemporary patterns of reflexive modernization, the kinds of industrial systems that we've developed to increase economic growth, to increase these raises, and yes, absolute incomes for everybody, are coming along with a bunch of very unfortunate so-called side effects. People in the global north are prepared to say that these are just either developmental necessities or historical accidents. Things could have played out differently. Or this is simply a necessary stage that we go through, where incomes, the gaps will open up, and then later we'll get back to equality. I don't see any prospect of that. And there's nothing in the documentation, there's no theoretical support for that. There's nothing in the statistical information that we have available that would suggest that kind of a turnaround. The inconvenient truth is these are not externally created. These are part of the successes of the industrial systems that we have. They're not the failures of the industrial systems. They're evidence of the successes of these systems. If we look at the values that are being promoted by these industrial systems, freedoms of choice for consumers, free, open and access to information, rising incomes globally, we have in fact achieved that. Increasing access to education, we in fact have achieved that. There are parts of the successes of what's been going on with globalization, but there's also the losses, these inequalities that are opening up. And what that forces us to confront is that these are not external causes, they're internal, and that we're experiencing not just a world of rapid change, but a world that's undergoing a change of eras, from a world dominated by what I would refer to as problem solution to a world dominated by predicament resolution. Problems occur when we have an existing set of aims and interests that we fully intend to continue pursuing and discover that for some reasons, perhaps unknown, our existing techniques and strategies for arriving at those ends and interests no longer work. We're getting consequences from those that either keep us from moving in that direction and reaching our aims and interests, or we're having ironic consequences, these productions of public bads. Problems can be solved. And the way that you solve a problem is you come up with a new technique that allows you to continue arriving at those ends. The hybrid automobile is a great solution to the problem of carbon emissions from transportation. If individually owned automobiles are part of the problem, gas-burning engines produce lots of carbon, the hybrid engine is a great solution to that problem. It's a solution to a problem because it doesn't require us to question anything about transportation infrastructure. It doesn't question the culture of the automobile. It doesn't question anything about urban design and how we design our cities, our suburbs, our urban areas, or in rural-urban relations. It doesn't require anything other than a new production system for a new kind of an engine. It's a good solution to the problem of carbon emissions. It says nothing much at all about issues of climate change. Climate change is not a problem. Climate change is a predicament. Predicaments occur not when we are made to be aware that we've got strategy problems or technique problems. Predicaments occur when we're meant to be aware that there's a conflict among our own values and interests. That it's not that we've got a set of abiding interests that we can continue working to with new techniques quite happily. What we've got is a conflict among our values. Climate change is one such conflict. We know exactly what to do technically in terms of addressing issues of climate change. Quit throwing carbon into the atmosphere. It's quite simple, actually. We've got the technical know-how to be able to pull that off. We've got the technology for it. We've got the science nailed. Why are we not doing it? Because we've got conflicts of values. There's a conflict among environmental values and political values, cultural values, economic values, etc., social values. When we become aware that we've got a predicament, what we do not have is the set of criteria that will allow us to set the parameters to decide what a solution would consist in. It's precisely the nature of what would count as a solution that's in question with a predicament. Predicaments can't be solved because we can't say what a solution would consist in. In an engineering sense, the hybrid engine is great because if it's reduced, keep the automobile, keep that constraint. Keep the constraint of the individual automobile. Find a way to produce less carbon using an automobile. You redesign an engine. You've got the parameters to decide what a solution would consist in. How much better does it need to be than a gas-burning one to be effective and saleable and so on and so forth. Predicaments can't be solved, they can only be resolved. Where resolution implies two things. It implies clarity with regard to how the situation that we're involved in got to be the way it is. So resolution in the sense that when you take a photograph with a digital camera, if you've got more pixels, you get higher resolution. If you've got enough resolution, you can build that picture, you can project it on a 12-foot by 12-foot or 12-meter by 12-meter screen and still have access to very detailed information on it. That's high-resolution photography. So we need high-resolution understanding of the complex systems that are involved in producing the situations that we're experiencing. But resolution is also used, at least in the US, and I guess here probably you do the same thing, make New Year's resolutions. Most of us don't live up to our New Year's resolutions, like it or not, but resolution also means a firm commitment. And predicaments can only be resolved in both of those senses. It requires both highly detailed information about how things got to be the way they are, a detailed understanding of that, and clear commitments of how we're going to respond to that, a shared set of commitments for responding to it. Now what's interesting is because of the way in which network dynamics play out, the fact that growth under network circumstances requires this amplification of interactions and also increase of differentiation processes. We live in a world where globalization is bringing about, yes, increasing integration, increasing interdependence, and indeed interpenetration of societies and economies and so on, but also the magnification and multiplication of differences. Some of those differences are differences of the sort, the economic sort that we've cited, inequalities of wealth, income, resource access, and so on. Some of them are the uneven distribution of risks, threats, and hazards around the world, with those risks, threats, and hazards disproportionately going to those who are least able to adapt to or avert them. So it's partly those kinds of differences, but it's also because of the nature of the global predicaments that we face. having to deal with cultural and values differences. So dealing with predicaments, that is, conflicts among values that are not just taking place within a society, within a given cultural framework, but across cultural frameworks. And so we're undergoing a tradition globally of a shift with this problem to predicament transition, of a shift from the predominance of the technical to that of the ethical, but also a mandate to develop, in some sense, an ethics of difference. An ethics in which taking differences into account is done not just in a haphazard way, and not just in a sort of a purely nominal sense where we say, everybody has a right to be different in this society. We've got one of those in the US. And it doesn't guarantee anything like justice. It doesn't guarantee anything like a lessening of those gaps that are opening up between the rich and the poor. There's perfect consistency between the system of tolerating differences and those inequalities. Tolerance in engineering terms means a degree of difference that can be comfortably ignored. And that's an important concept. And politically, it means the degree of difference politically, or culturally, or socially, or in terms of gender that we can ignore. But the truth of the matter is that in the 21st century, these network dynamics, reflexive globalization, the kinds of cultural changes that have been taking place, really make us confront, along with this transition from the technical to the ethical, a transition is framed by an aporia, and that is, we know that we need to take differences into account to a depth and extent that we haven't had to historically. Some of those relate to issues of gender, they relate to ethnicity, they relate to religion, they relate to cultural differences. We know that we need to do that. We can't get away with not doing that. The world has changed enough for us to know that. At the same time, predicaments like climate change compel us to work across those differences, to subsume those differences within globally shared sets of commitments, to engage in collective action at the scale that's necessary to respond to things like climate change. Now that sounds like an impossibility. How do you both give increasing recognition and respect to difference and at the same time subsume those differences within some sort of collective action? And I think one of the things that makes us become aware of is that there's a need to go beyond the kind of global agenda of cosmopolitanism, this is kind of Stephen Toulmin's term, to go beyond the cosmopolitan agenda of universalization, a sort of global unity as an ideal, the values of equality, the values of choice, the values of autonomy, sovereignty, etc., that are associated with modernity, but also to go beyond the postmodern inversion of those values that would replace sameness with difference, that would invert the relationship between those, but remain aligned with the valorization of autonomy, the valorization of equality. Now, if we need to somehow go beyond both global unification and free variation, the sort of postmodern ideal of particularity as opposed to universality, where does that leave us? We've got an issue with respect to difference opening up. These are economic differences. They're cultural differences. We've got predicaments that require us to resolve those differences. And how do we go about doing that? Higher education is interesting because it's a site in which all of that comes together. It's a place in which we've got international student bodies, by and large now, at most major universities, in which we've got cultural differences present on campus. And diversity is something that everybody champions. You know, we're big on it in the US, and I guess probably here you're just as big on diversity. But if you ask the question, why? What's the value of diversity? I mean, I can measure my waistline, and I know that more is not better. You know, we could talk about cars on the road, and we know that more is not better. So what's the value of diversity? If diversity just means having people or disciplines in greater numbers in a given setting, how is that an advantage at all? Why should we worry about it? Why should we promote it? Why should we pursue it? And I think it's an interesting one because it forces us to confront questions about the structure of higher education and the globally dominant paradigm of higher education. That paradigm it's an old one. It goes back to 1576 and Peter Ramus, a French philosopher and mathematician, who had the very radical idea that higher education, or education in general, should no longer be based on the studio model. The studio model was you find a master of a given area of knowledge that you wanted to learn, you apprentice yourself to the master, work under the master for an indefinite period, as long as it took to get to the required level of mastery for you to go out on your own and do that job. Ramus came along and said that, quite controversially at the time, that the studio model, this apprenticeship model, can and should be replaced. That knowledge is not something that requires long-term, open-ended relational interaction. Knowledge is something that is quantifiable and deliverable, that it comes in uniquely describable packets, that is most efficiently and effectively delivered through standardized, methodized courses of instruction. And he was the first person to coin the term curriculum. Anyone know what the term curriculum, where it derives from in Latin? It was a term for the race course around which chariots were raced. So the idea of curriculum as an educational term was framed by Ramus with that in mind, that education should be undertaken like a competition around a racetrack. There's a definite length, it's fixed, it's standardized, and we simply see who gets done first. They get the highest grade, they progress to the next level. And we've inherited this system. And it developed at the same time as the sciences were developing, as global markets were developing, at the same time as modernity was taking hold across Europe. And so the idea behind the kind of globally dominant paradigm is that a curriculum-based, standardized, universalized, methodized form of education. And it's been marvelously effective. Up through at least the latter part of the 20th century, anywhere that model of education took root, you saw the same phenomenon occurring. It was a rationalization of the labor force, that is to say, an increasing differentiation within the labor force. You saw overall incomes rising. You saw overall life expectancies going up. You saw national incomes and productivity going up. Everything looked very good about the model until sometime around the end of the 20th century, when the kinds of differences that we started the discussion with, these experiences have somehow, this education system is no longer responding to contemporary needs. The one-size-fits-all model of higher education doesn't work. And so what's the appropriate response? The market response is, let's go to an individually biased, choice-mediated form of education. In the US, we're really big on that. There's tremendous involvement in it. It has to do with online education, so students can take courses on demand at any time. So you don't have to be present in the classroom. You don't have to show up when the instructor's there. You log on to the site at any time that's convenient for you and respond to it. Coursework that's done like consumption is done nowadays over the internet. And that's a powerful model in one way, and it's very efficient in one way, but it's very ineffective. And I think part of my concern with it is that it's a system, it's an approach to responding to contemporary dilemmas that we're facing that accepts the market mentality and remains neutral with respect to how the kinds of economic systems that education is preparing students to join, how that's affecting their future life prospects. In other words, it's sort of agnostic about the structures that are being invested in. That yes, higher education up until the present has been very good at giving markets and national governments what they need. It's been very good about giving corporations, the military-industrial communications complex, what it needs to continue growing in the way it's done. That military-industrial communications complex, under conditions of network structuring and reflexive modernization, are producing the kinds of inequalities that we're experiencing, the kinds of massive redistributions of wealth, income, and resource access to an increasingly small sliver of the planet's population. To the extent that higher education remains embedded within and subservient to those interests, it's complicit with it. It's ethically complicit with it. And so I think that we need to step back in higher education and question the degree to which, on ethical grounds, not on technical grounds, not on the technical grounds of can we deliver education to individuals on demand? Yes, we can. The question we should be asking is, should we be doing that? And so I think that what we need to do is to reframe in some ways the way that we're approaching responses to contemporary realities by taking these notions of difference really quite seriously. And part of my own framing of that is to talk in terms of a contrast between difference understood in terms of mere variety and understood in terms of diversity. Difference is the issue. Difference is ongoing. Differentiation is crucial for continued economic growth. We need the growth to continue producing benefits of the sort that people around the world want. So we can't reject differentiation, but how do we do differentiation equitably? How do we deal with difference equitably? So the contrast that I'm drawing is between the simple fact of different things being in a room. This room is not like the ones that we have in Hawaii. If this was a room in Hawaii, I'd look around the world and I could say, we've got at least 6 different ethnic groups represented in the room. Here I'm not so sure. By faces I can't really tell. It says something about ethnicity. I can see a few differences at least. You can see variety, ethnic variety, gender variety to some extent. You can see those at a glance. Variety is just a quantitative index of multiplicity. It implies nothing other than coexistence. It's just different things being present, people of different persuasions being present. Diversity is a relational achievement, as I would define it. Diversity is not something that you can see at a glance. Diversity is present, if at all, only when the differences that are present in a given situation are activated as the basis of mutual contribution to sustainably shared flourishing. In a classroom setting, you may have students from 6 or 8 different countries representing maybe 10 or 12 if they're bicultural kids like we have in Hawaii. They may represent 10 or 12 different cultural frameworks that they're operating in. You begin with cultural variety in the room. Whether or not at the end of a term you've achieved cultural diversity in the room is a measure of the degree to which the differences present among the students in the room and the instructor in the room have been engaged in the way that they need to create the conditions for the emergence of an awareness not just of how much we differ from one another, but how well we are differing for one another. That diversity implies not just difference from, but also difference for. To kind of give a concrete example, in a zoo, you may have all the species. If you're Bill Gates, you could build a perfect zoo in which every species in a naturally occurring ecosystem was present in the zoo. But if you remove all the outside inputs to the zoo, the medical stuff that's being pumped in, the electricity, the water, human energy that's going into taking care of cleaning the cages or the exhibits and so on, all the species in the zoo would very soon pass away. In a zoo, you've got lots of species variety. In an ecosystem, you have species diversity. In an ecosystem, the differences between species are engaged. They're part of the basis of the mutual contribution of each of the species to the total ecosystem. So the ecosystem as a whole becomes self-sustaining and adaptive as a system. So what we're looking for in higher education, I think, as a response to the complex issues that we're facing, is seeing how we can embody the value of diversity in the classrooms, in cultural terms, in cognitive terms, and that it has implications. It means moving away from the academy that's sort of siloed into different disciplines, where each of us, in terms of both our professional development and our accreditation, in terms of our the reward structure, promotion structure in higher education, saying that interdisciplinarity is not an extra. Interdisciplinarity should be at the focus of what we're doing. Not just because diversity is a value that we have, but because diversity is precisely, cognitive diversity is precisely what we need to be able to address the kinds of global predicaments that we're facing. If we really want to look at climate change and develop policies that are related to affecting real change related to climate, we need to have politicians involved, people in political science, people in philosophy, people in environmental studies, people in anthropology, people in the natural sciences. You need multidisciplinary groups to be able to do that kind of work. And they can't be just incidentally related. They have to be related in the way that's necessary for them to realize that there's something to be gained from their differences from one another in terms of their cognitive styles. There's lots of evidence that when we're talking about dealing with issues that require truly creative responses, not simply solving problems based on existing methods and existing ideas, but really doing cutting-edge work, that a cognitively diverse group will outperform a cognitively unified group. That a cognitive monoculture is not as effective in dealing with those kinds of issues as a diverse cognitive ecology. So what we're looking at is a shift from the focus on bodies of knowledge that are deliverable through curricula, that is, these methodized, standardized, universalized courses of instruction, to realizing an academy, a university, that's organized around ecologies of knowledge as opposed to bodies of knowledge. It's also taking internationalization not just as an opportunity to have students from different countries present together in a university context, but to take internationalization as an opportunity to gain high degree resolution on the kinds of predicaments that we're facing because of the input of the different perspectives that we've got from students and researchers and faculty from different regions, to get those differences of perspective and gaining higher resolution in terms of understandings of the dynamics that have led up to these predicaments that we're facing, but also as an experimental basis for developing the kinds of resolve, these cross-cultural kinds of resolve that are necessary to respond to those kinds of issues. In some ways, it means moving away from the model that we've been forced into through the kind of globally dominant paradigm of higher education, of excluding to one side what we would refer to as wisdom and saying that's to be done outside the university context. That's to be done at home or in the church or in your meditation practice. You may develop that. And instead to say that we need more than just factual knowledge, knowing that things are the case, or skills, knowing how to do things. We also need to develop among our students and ourselves greater sensitivity to and the sensibilities that are involved in both understanding whether to act in a certain way under certain circumstances and the exact way in which to do that. So in a sense, to go back to the pre-modern understanding of knowledge, which was wedded to wisdom as part of a continuum, rather than this exclusive sort of knowledge takes place in one way, wisdom is something entirely separate. So we face circumstances where we're being asked, I think, in many ways to reconfigure our basic understanding of what higher education is about, moving away from an emphasis on problem solution to one on predicament resolution, a form of education in which the humanities and social sciences play really crucial roles, and in which the increasing emphasis on STEM, on science, technology, engineering, medicine, without comparable emphasis on the humanities and social sciences, is not just lopsided, it's not just unproductive, it's actually harmful. And in the long run, it becomes harmful because we become blind to exactly the kinds of phenomena that would be required in terms of sharing across differences to be able to respond to these issues in an effective and sustainable way. Maybe I'll end with that on a somewhat hopeful note that it sounds in some ways kind of daunting that we could ever address that kind of change, begin to produce it. Fortunately, the value of diversity, as I sort of played it out, is a bit of a hopeful sign because it really can't come about unless each one of us contributes to it. Fortunately, it's not something that I can do or you could do alone. None of us can do it alone. We can only do it together. It is our project. And that's encouraging because I think that while none of us alone could really affect the kinds of changes that we're talking about, if we can figure out how to make use of our differences, our very real differences, and to not disarm them, to not ignore them, to not merely tolerate them, but to say there's something to be learned from these differences, that we can learn with one another from our differences, then I think we can begin to affect the kinds of changes that we need. Thank you.
Thank you very much.